Some of you might have heard of the Black Label games. That's at least what we refer to them as at Gamestop. For a long time, it was just something we talked about and joked around about at the store, but lately I found myself looking into this more and trying to find out more online. But I have found a limited amount of information. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Black Label games, they're literally games with all black labels on the case, and inside the case is a disc, which also has a blank label. One of these Black Label games comes in every box we receive at the store. So for example, if we get a shipment of a certain Call of Duty game, the box will be full of regular game copies, with one Black Label game. It will be shrink wrapped in plastic just like all the other games. It just won't have a real label. The commonly accepted explanation for this is that when the games are manufactured, a test copy is produced to ensure the game works properly. But employees doubt this explanation quite often. For one, it doesn't really make sense for them to send it to us at the store. Also, the standard for what we do with them is pretty weird. When we get a box, we open it up, and then just throw away the Black Label game as we're unpacking them. And since they are test prints, they are fully functioning games, believe it or not. It's actually against the rules for us to keep the game, and that's not just a store policy, it's a corporate one too. So that's the weird part, but it definitely gets a little more interesting. Obviously, with something weird like that, there's tons of speculating. For most of us, we usually just toss them out, not giving it a second thought. But other times, employees will go on about how they carry a curse and will bring bad luck or kill whoever dares to play them. Every time somebody mentions something like that, I just laugh it off. I don't believe in stuff like that. How on earth would playing a game affect your life like that? But I have to admit, there's been some weird things that have happened that I know are all coincidences, but they just add fuel to the fire surrounding these rumors. I've heard different stories about things that have happened to people who've played the Black Label games. But that's all they are. Stories. So I won't waste your time talking about them. But I've witnessed a couple of things for myself since working at GameStop, or at least been able to confirm that they happened. The first time, it was a young kid who would consistently go dumpster diving behind our store, looking for old games or anything else he might find that he thought was worth keeping. It wasn't too unusual to find him back there from time to time while taking out the trash in the evening. He's a nice kid, always very polite and respectful to us, so none of us really mind. I was working the night this kid, Craig, found one of these Black Label games while dumpster diving. I walked out back to take out the trash, and there he was, standing next to the dumpster looking through some items he had pulled out of it. I said hi to him, and he asked about the game, wondering what it was. I told him I wasn't sure what game it was, but I explained to him how they're made, and how it could be any number of games, depending on what day it ended up in the dumpster. He was pretty excited, and left with the game and a couple of other things. I didn't run into him for about 5 or 6 days after that, until he came into the store with his mom one day. They were coming in to buy a new PlayStation 4 and a few other things. I asked him which game the Black Label game ended up being. He told me it was Fallout 4. He said he was really excited about it, but after playing the game non-stop for 2 days straight, his house was broken into when he was at school and his parents were at work. The robber took everything of value, including his gaming system and all of his games. I obviously felt really bad for the kid, but I also had this sense of curiosity about the situation that I just couldn't shake. I had heard all the stories, but this was the first time I actually knew for sure something bad had happened to somebody shortly after playing one of those games. But deep down, I was sure it was just a coincidence. I've run into Craig out back of our store several times since then, and all seemed well, but he stopped coming around a few months ago. He probably got sick of the dumpsters, or his parents found out and made him stop. So, as you can imagine, once I told the guys I worked with about what happened to Craig, they all joked about how it was the curse of the Black Label games. I continued to call bullshit on the whole thing, and insisted there was no way it was true. Eventually, 2 of the guys I work with continually dared our co-worker Steven to take one of the games home. Steven was the youngest associate at the store. Like me, he too said that the games had no curse and the whole thing was made up. He said that he would have no problem playing any of them, but once he was dared to do it, he seemed hesitant. He told us he would, but didn't want to get into trouble for taking one of them home, and we weren't supposed to even open them, so he couldn't play it in the store. But when the other guys called him out and said the real reason was because he was too scared, he eventually gave in. We actually assisted him by taking the game out of the garbage bag once we were outside and leaving it by the dumpster. And after a few days, nothing happened. He came back in and gave us the whole "I told you so" response. We began asking him if he actually was even playing the game. He assured us he was, but we had no idea whether he was telling the truth or not. So one of the guys who was egging him on, Paul, offered to go play it with him. Steve made up some excuses at first, but eventually agreed. The night after they got together, Paul and I were scheduled to work together. I saw Paul as expected, and we talked about how everything went. He and Steven played the game together for a while, and that was about it. But 2 days later, Steve missed his shift. He didn't even call to say that he wasn't coming in. At first, I assumed he didn't know he was scheduled to work, as our schedules would change a bit from week to week. I sent him a text and called him but didn't get a response. When he missed his next shift, I started to get concerned. Paul and the other guy said that the curse of the Black Label game had killed him, blah blah blah. We were never able to contact him on the phone, so eventually I went to his house to get some answers. I knocked on the door and a woman who turned out to be his mom answered. She told me that Steven was at home and that he was fine, but he didn't want to leave his bedroom or talk to anyone. Apparently, he's been doing nothing aside from playing games and watching TV. His mom is very worried about him, but at least he's safe. This kind of creeped me out a bit because of how coincidental it was. And the kid having a mental break alone is just kind of scary to think about, especially since it could happen to anyone, including myself. Paul seemed fine though, and he continued to show up to work after playing the game, so I felt assured it had nothing to do with the game. But now I just don't know what to think. I still work with Paul, and he's always been the smart one at the store. He's a college student, or at least he was. Over the last 2 months, Paul has been struggling in school. He says that no matter what he does, he can't keep his grades up, even with information he already knew. He can't seem to put it down correctly on tests. It got bad enough where he ended up getting kicked out of school for failing his classes. He had a scholarship too, due to his perfect grades all through high school. He lost his scholarship and has been insanely depressed ever since. He says all sorts of things that really concern me. He keeps showing up for work, and most of the time, he at least appears to be okay, but he really seems to be deteriorating. Some of the things he says makes me think he's considering ending his life, but when I ask him if he's suicidal, he promises me he's not. Now, I'm still a skeptic, but I'll admit, I will never be present if and when a Black Label game is played again. To me, it's just like a knock on wood kind of thing. If somehow, some way, the rumors are even partially true, then it's worth staying away from these games. So if you haven't heard of Black Label games from Gamestop before, now you know. If you ever come across one in the trash, at a garage sale, or a friend has, just remember, there's a very small possibility that there's something more going on than just a simple video game.
The Curse by Jeff R. So I've worked at GameStop now for about a year, give or take. When I first started, a couple of the guys I worked with told me about the Black Label games. I had read about this a couple years before I started working at GameStop, but always assumed it was made up in some way or another. From what I remember reading about them, is that they were these mysterious cursed versions of a video game that would randomly show up at GameStops and that no one knew how they got there. And while the majority of that is completely false, there is a real reason the rumor kind of snowballed into what it has. These random cursed games aren't actually games. They're actually not even random. Basically, every time we get a shipment of a certain game from a manufacturer, there's a game in the box that is completely blank. It comes shrink-wrapped like the other games, but the label is all black, as if it were left blank. Inside the case, there is a regular disc in it with another blank label. If you were to put the game into whichever gaming system it's for, it appears to play like normal. Now I know this sounds weird, but there's actually an explanation behind it that makes total sense. When I finally ended up asking my manager about these, he kind of just rolled his eyes and said a lot of people like to talk about them, but that they're nothing more than test prints. Basically, when they print off a box of a certain game, a test print is done to make sure the game is printing functionally. These prints are left blank as to not waste ink, and they are both test prints and supposed to be used for demos in stores. Now, the only flaw in that is that we get specific demo discs, and these discs do not contain the full version of any game. But it's also possible my manager doesn't even know the full reason behind them. But the rumor was, according from other GameStop employees that have been working here prior to me starting, is that if you take one of the Black Label games home and play it, bad or weird things begin happening. Not in the sense of it being some hacked or weird game, but just like the game itself bringing bad luck. Kind of similar to the Madden curse. If you're not familiar with the Madden curse, it's a theory that was made up that states that any NFL player that is featured on the cover of that year's Madden game will be injured shortly after, and it's actually been quite oddly accurate. I had mostly forgotten about the Black Label games, or the theory behind them, for quite a while, up until recently. I had become accustomed to just throwing them away, as we weren't really supposed to take them home, but they also weren't able to be sold. That was until we hired someone new about a month or so ago at my store. His name is Eric, and eventually, after his first couple weeks, he asked me about the Black Label games, what they were, and why we just threw them in the trash. I told him what the legend behind them was, and then what the real reason we had them was. He asked why we didn't just take them home, and I told him that we weren't supposed to. When he asked me why we couldn't take them home, I really wasn't able to give him a good answer, but that we just weren't supposed to. He said, well, I guess no one would miss the game if I happened to remove it from the trash and put it in my coat. I just remember shrugging my shoulders at him, as I couldn't have cared less if he took it. I just knew we weren't supposed to, and I wasn't going to risk my job over it. So, he ended up taking the game and putting it in his coat. The next day at work, I asked him if he ended up playing it, and if so, if he liked it. He told me he played it all night, and asked if we got these Black Label games for every game. I told him they came in every case of games we received, and he seemed pretty surprised. I personally eventually just ended up looking at them like they were extra trash in the box, like the bubble wrap and extra cardboard bits. I kid you not, that very evening, on Eric's way home from work, he was rear-ended by a distracted driver. Now, he wasn't hurt badly, and this could have easily been a coincidence, but it doesn't end there. When he sent his car in to be repaired, it ended up being broken into while sitting in the shop's parking lot overnight, and he had quite a bit of valuables stolen out of it. Once he told me this, I still believed it to be a coincidence, but out of curiosity, I asked him if he was still playing the game. At that point, he told me he had finished the campaign and let his friend borrow it. A few days went by, and I found myself having to pry into Eric and ask him if his friend liked the game, and that I wanted to know because I was considering buying it. That's when he told me that he wasn't sure. He said his friend said he liked the game so far, having played it the first day he had it. But the next day, he had to go out of town because his grandfather suddenly died of a heart attack, and he needed to be with family and then attend the services. Now, I was pretty surprised by this, and it isn't enough to sell me on anything for sure. I mean, I'm a huge skeptic, and it's not like all of these events have been directly related to one another, but I know in the future, if anyone else asks me about these games, I'm at least going to tell them what happened to Eric and his friend.
Stalked by a GameStop employee by Sarah R. I became a gamer a bit later in life than most. As a girl, I didn't have a ton of friends who were into it, so I never really found out how amazing gaming was until I was about 20 years old. As of right now, I'm 26, but this story took place when I was 22. I was still pretty new to gaming, but it was at this point that I really started getting into it. I finally decided to upgrade to a PlayStation 3. I went to a Gamestop that wasn't too far from my house and started browsing some of the games they had on display so I could decide what I'd buy along with my PS3. There was a man working there. He was probably about 30 years old. He asked me if I needed help. I told him that I was planning on buying a PS3 and was browsing some of the games in the meantime. For about the next 10 minutes, he continued to talk to me even though I insisted that I really didn't need his help and was just browsing. It didn't really bother me too much though. I kind of just assumed that he was bored as I was the only one in the store for a decent period of time. I eventually picked out a couple of games and brought them to the counter. The store employee got a PS3 for me and rang me up. He then handed me a piece of paper and told me that the PS3 came with a warranty. He said to write down my name, phone number, address, and email address. Although, I would like to mention that this was a blank sheet of paper. I asked him if that was normal. He told me he actually needed to put all this information on a computer, but the system was down and he would do it later. I was a bit put off by this, but didn't want to be out of luck if something turned out to be wrong with this, as I heard in recent news stories that some of the older PS3s were crapping out on people. So I wrote down everything he asked for. He handed me my bag and said goodbye. I drove straight home and set up my PS3 immediately and begun playing. I was in absolute love with it. The PS3 had been out for quite a while by this point, but it was new to me and definitely a big step up from the PS2. A couple of days went by as I spent much time playing the new game as possible. One evening, I got home from work and started my PS3. A few minutes later after getting started, my phone went off. I grabbed my phone and saw that I had a new text from a phone number I didn't recognize. All it said was, "Are you enjoying the new PS3?" Although I didn't know who was sending me this, I was kind of curious to find out, so I replied, "Yeah, I am. Who is this?" I went back to my game, but before I could barely get started again, my phone went off again. I checked the number that had sent it to me. "Oh, it's Ethan from Gamestop. Just making sure everything's going well with the new system." It's a little uncomfortable with this random guy texting me, but thought that maybe it was something normal. So I replied with, "Yeah, it's fine," and asked him, "Do you guys normally text your customers to check in on them?" He replied back with, "Only the pretty ones," with a stupid looking smiley face. This had me really creeped out, and I decided that I wasn't going to text him back anymore, as I probably should have to begin with. He sent me only one other text at night, just telling me that I could contact him directly if I ended up having any issues or needed anything else. Yeah, I'm pretty sure he meant to have emphasis on anything else. I didn't hear from him for another couple of days after that, but I quickly forgot about him. That was until once again he sent me another text one evening saying, "So, did you set up the account to play games online?" I did not reply to him. I knew that eventually he would take a hint. Once again, a couple of days went by and then I heard from him again. Just like the last time, he sent me a text saying, "If you ever need any new games, I can get you a discount." And just like the last time, I didn't reply to him. It was the next day that the tone of the text messages started to change. He eventually started saying things like, "Can you at least answer me? Why aren't you replying anymore?" I was not happy with this new style of texting he's forced upon me. But I'd also like to mention I didn't feel scared or threatened or anything. He seemed like a guy who was a bit pathetic and didn't have the best social skills. He ended up calling me a few times and even sent me an email saying that I thought my phone might not have been working. All of these attempts at contacting me went without replies as usual. Things went quiet again for the next few days until one night while I was home, it must have been around 8 p.m., I got a knock at the door. At this point, I was living alone in a small one-bedroom apartment, so I didn't go around throwing my door open every time I got an unexpected knock at it. I quietly crept up to the door and looked through the people, and I was horrified to see that Ethan from Gamestop was there. I can remember that this was the first time I actually begun to feel threatened by this man. At first, it all seemed like someone who was harmless, trying to contact me out of sheer boredom or some pitiful sex life that has not gone well for him at this point in time. But showing up to my apartment, that was going the next level. I felt like I had a stalker in the making here. I crept away from the door to make sure to stay out of sight from any windows. He once again knocked. Then it was quiet for a minute. My phone suddenly rang, and it was from his number. Luckily, my phone was always kept on vibrate, and he wouldn't be able to hear it ring from my door. I sat still for what must have been another 30 minutes until I finally felt it was safe enough to move around in my apartment again. I was unsure what to do at this point because I started to feel unsafe at my own home. I ended up calling to GameStop and talking to his manager, and they told me that they would take care of the issue and apologized to me. Told me that I had nothing to worry about. Usual GameStop spiel. The very next evening, I got home from work. After parking my car, I got out of it, and immediately I heard a man's voice. It was Ethan. He was coming towards me, screaming at me. I immediately hopped back into my car and locked the doors, and that's when he came to my window, screaming at me, calling me a bitch, saying that he was trying to do nice things for me and that I was simply ungrateful. That's when I pulled out my phone and called 911. The moment he saw that phone touch my ear, he ended up racing off. I ended up filing a temporary protection order against him, and after the sheriff's department notified him of this, he didn't come to court to contest it. I never heard from him again, but I hope that I never do.
Having been an avid gamer my entire life, I'm obviously pretty familiar with what GameStop is. I think I was maybe 4 years old when I first started playing video games, and as far as I can remember, I haven't stopped playing them at any point. I started with the Sega Genesis and eventually ended up with the PlayStation 4. I've had quite a few systems in between. My gaming career, if it could be called a career, peaked a couple of years ago. I think it was all the way back in the year 2007 when I first played the original Uncharted game for the PS3. I was absolutely amazed by the game. It was way ahead of its time. Not surprisingly, I pre-ordered Uncharted 2 Among Thieves from GameStop once I heard about its release. This, I believe, was in 2009, and it was even better than the original. It also contained something extra the first one didn't: online play. I first got into the co-op side of the multiplayer, and then eventually the competitive side, but the furthest I ever went with it was rather leisurely play of the game. This changed in 2011, when Uncharted 3 came out. I got into the competitive side of the game, and played it quite religiously for over 3 years. I ended up running my own clan, and even won money playing in a competition. But unfortunately, the story has less to do with actual video games and more to do with the events that surrounded me obtaining the games. It took place in 2011, when I went into GameStop to pre-order Uncharted 3. It had been a while since I had last been to GameStop at this point. When I went in to purchase my pre-order, there was an employee there who I had never seen before. She was an absolutely gorgeous girl who I'll call Leslie. As soon as I saw her, she stood out, and not because we were in a GameStop. This girl would have stood out anywhere. The second thing that went through my head after looking at her was that she must get hit on constantly at a job like this. I actually can remember purposely going out of my way not to even look at her again until I was paying for my reservation, and also to treat her as normal as I would anyone. But to my surprise, she was incredibly talkative to me. And not just that, but she also seemed to be trying to keep the conversation going every time it was ending before I left the store. Although I really had no reason to, I kept finding myself thinking about her over the course of the next few days. I really wanted to go back to the store to see if she was working, and even though it wouldn't be weird for me to go up to a Gamestop just to browse and kind of hang out, I would feel weird if I did while she was working. So I made sure to come up with reasons to go to the store often. Unfortunately, the only reasons I could come up with were to buy things. The first time I went in, I bought a controller. It was cool because I needed a new one anyway, kind of. And I got to talk to Leslie quite a bit more. The next time I went in, I bought some random video game. I couldn't even tell you what it was at this point. Maybe a zombie version of Red Dead Redemption, which I easily could have downloaded instead. But it seemed like a great decision at the time. I talked with Leslie even more this time, and I was getting ready to leave, and she actually ended up giving me her number. I planned on waiting a couple of days to contact her, but I was too excited and sent her a text later that night. She replied and seemed to be happy to hear from me, so I ended up not regretting the decision. We spent a ton of time texting one another over the next few nights, and spoke over the phone a couple of times as well. At that point, we decided to hang out. On our first date, we went out to eat and went on a walk after. We hung out almost every night for the following week, and then she ended up spending the night at my house for the first time. At this point, I was absolutely thrilled to be with a girl like her. I honestly didn't think things could have gotten any better. She told me how much she liked me, and I just felt lucky above all else. This ended up changing the third or fourth time she stayed the night at my house. We had both fallen asleep together, and were woken up by a loud banging noise. I went to look out the window that allowed me to see down to my front door. There was a random guy standing there that I didn't recognize. At that point, Leslie came over to the window and looked too. She said, "Oh my God," and went on to say that it was her ex-boyfriend that she had broken up with several months prior. She said he has been harassing her on and off and is extremely jealous still, and must have found out she was now dating a new guy. We were both confused on how he was able to find her. If he followed her to my house, why did he wait hours before knocking on the door? She told me that she was afraid of him, so I snuck downstairs and double-checked that my door was locked. He knocked and called her name for about 10 minutes, and then finally left. She ended up sneaking out very early next morning, in case he was still waiting for her. For the next few nights she continued coming over, but began parking on the next street over, so her ex wouldn't know that she was at my place. It seemed to work at first, until one evening we were hanging out and relaxing, when the knocking began again. When I checked, it was him again. I told Leslie I was going outside to confront him. She told me not to and that he was dangerous. I told her that I was only going to talk to him and try to work this out. She begged me not to go outside, and even tried physically holding me back from going, but I was adamant to end this. I went outside, leaving Leslie inside so that she was safe. The guy started yelling at me, but I cut him off and told him that Leslie and I were together now. I said, "She dumped you months ago. You're not her boyfriend anymore, and you need to leave her alone." "Boyfriend?" he replied. "I'm her fucking husband, and she didn't break up with me. We're not even separated either. We still live together, except when she comes over here to stay with you." I honestly didn't believe him at first, but after a few minutes, he had provided me with bits of proof that showed me he was telling the truth. Not only was he telling the truth, but since they were on the same cell phone plan, he was able to use the Find My iPhone feature on her phone and track her to my house since he had access to the plan. I was completely shocked, a bit heartbroken, and totally full of anger. I asked the husband to wait outside while I went in to go get her. I can even remember talking in depths to calm myself while I was walking up the stairs, but when I finally got upstairs, she was gone. She must have known that she was caught and snuck out of the back door to her car while I was talking to her husband. I let him know what happened, and even offered for him to come in and check for himself, but he believed me. "Sounds like her," he said, and he just got into his car and left. I never saw or heard from either of them again. I also never went back to that particular GameStop, except to pick up Uncharted 3, and I made sure she wasn't working when I did. I also have no clue how her marriage ended up, and I don't really care. I do feel bad for the husband. Take it from me. Never be too trusting of someone you just met. Don't get caught up in the feeling of lust for someone. But I did have a lot of free time after that, and ended up winning a decent amount of money from competitions for Uncharted 3. So suck it, Leslie.
The Truth at Corporate GameStop by Anonymous. So I am an employee at GameStop. I don't know much about video games, and honestly, I don't even play them. Video games have nothing to do with my actual job, aside from them kind of funding it. I am a regional statistics analyst. My job is all numbers. Throughout the US, GameStop stores are divided into different regions. Throughout these regions, for example, there will be different ad campaigns. I'll then compare the numbers between regions to find out what works and what doesn't work. That's just a small example of the many boring things I do in an average day. Most of the guys and gals I work with at the particular office building I'm at are pretty big gamers, and that's why they picked GameStop to work for. Many of them were promoted up from the store level, but most of them got their jobs because they have degrees, like me. I graduated from college and looked for places hiring, and here I am. It is an awful job, but it pays well, and I went to school for a long time and spent a lot of money in student loans to get this job. I've made friends with a lot of people over the course of working here. The building I work at is one of only many corporate locations, but there are a lot of departments within my building. But the real horror seems to lie, or at least stem, from the marketing sector. In the past, I went on a bit of a tour of certain retail stores. By visiting these stores, it was to help us at the corporate level to better understand the day-to-day operations they go through, and therefore give us insight on how we can make improvements. But soon after we began touring the stores, I felt like I had no point in being there. All everyone talked about was marketing and producing more sales. As an analyst, I felt like my presence was unnecessary. But I really did get to see just how much pressure was put on these sales reps in the stores. Back at the corporate office, I became friends with a guy named Kevin. He was the executive manager of the marketing department at our location. With his level of seniority, he pretty much had the ability to do what he wants, and therefore we would hang out a lot around the office, as he would often come over to my department. After a few years of working together, Kevin and I had become really good friends. We would hang out a lot outside of work, and found ourselves talking about work way too much. A lot of the time when we talked, it would be about the different issues of our jobs we were facing. Kevin would usually talk about a lot of the issues he would handle that came from the store level. Being in the marketing and sales department, he would talk about employees at the store level sending in complaints about the pressure put on them to make sales, and store managers complaining about their employees, things like that. But one night, we were hanging out and drinking like normal, and his personality seemed a lot different than normal. I'd barely even seen him in a bad mood prior to this, and now I could barely even get him to talk. I kept trying, but it just seemed like he'd completely shut down. The next day at work, he was acting the same way, and he didn't even meet me for lunch like normal. That weekend, I tried getting a hold of him to ask him if he wanted to do something to take his mind off work and threw out some ideas. I couldn't even get him to reply to me though. I felt bad for whatever he was going through and really wanted to talk to him about it. On Monday, I went into work and Kevin wasn't there. I tried calling him and his phone went directly to voicemail. When I got home, I checked the mail and noticed I had a piece of mail that didn't have a return address. Inside was a letter, and it turned out to be from Kevin. He told me that no matter what he did, he wasn't able to get his stores to meet the required sales. He said it was Friday when he was sending the letter out, and if he wasn't at work the following week, GameStop went through with their threats, He told me no matter what I did, to never mention this to anyone, and to leave GameStop as quickly as I could. I couldn't believe what I was reading. I stopped what I was doing and drove directly over to Kevin's house. His car was in the driveway, but I couldn't get him to answer the door, and his phone was still going straight to voicemail. The following day at work, I asked around about Kevin, and eventually I was told that he resigned from his position. Everyone said they had no clue what he did afterwards. I later found out that he was already replaced, just that quickly. I'm still having a hard time wrapping my head around this. It's been weeks, and a police report has been made and everything. Kevin is still listed as a missing person. I just can't figure out what I should really believe. The letter and the fact that Kevin vanished is all I have to go on. Part of me thinks that maybe he just decided he wanted to live on his own and disappear just to completely start over. The other part is worried that something worse is going on. I've considered handing the letter he sent me over to the police, but I'm scared if he was telling the truth, it wouldn't be smart on my behalf. For the time being, I haven't made up my mind on what happened or what I should do, so I've just gone on as if everything was normal. But just remember, the next time you go into a GameStop, or any store that has their employees sell to you, something much greater could be at stake than just a simple transaction.
My Boss Went Psycho by Tommy G. I used to work at a GameStop for a few years. When I first started working there, I was so excited and felt like I was so lucky. As so did many of my friends who wanted this job there as well. I started working there when I was 18. I quickly found out that it wasn't really a great place to work after all. First, it was a retail job dealing with the general public. I quickly came to find out that this generally sucks a lot of the time. Some people act nice, most people are indifferent, and then you have the assholes that come in at least once per shift just to ruin your day. But even all that aside, even if all the customers were awesome, the policies at GameStop make it impossible to both enjoy and keep your job at the same time. What I mean is that you have to push subscriptions and reservations on customers if you want to keep your job, or at least have any decent hours. So every time a customer comes in, already willing to spend their money at the store, I have to nag them to spend even more on our stuff, even though we really don't need it and our sales were never that bad. This upsets a lot of people, but normally they don't blow it out of proportion. I mean, I'm a pretty timid guy and I avoid confrontation anytime possible, so when people do get annoyed at me, I don't pressure them or anything. There are other guys here who work here will really hound people about reserving their games or buying subscriptions with spiels and things like, oh, you better reserve that copy or else you might not have it when it comes in, even though we both know that we only get a set number of games despite the reservation orders we get. And there's a good chance that even if you do reserve, you won't get your game. But this being said, it doesn't stop them from hounding. And these hounding about reserving games or buying subscriptions does eventually reward their persistence. It does earn them more sales on people who are simply just as timid as I am. And I guess a level of me, just a part of me just really resents that. For that reasons, they get more hours than I do. I understand why the manager does this, but it's still not fair to me. And it's not fair to the customer either. I'm a really good game advisor and overall a solid associate. I've gone through several managers since I've worked at that GameStop. The most current store manager has been all about pushing those extra little things to selling customers and getting our sales up. He's incredibly determined to make our store number one in sales, and I can tell that this guy is just naturally very competitive. This manager, Gordon, we'll call him, obviously ended up putting a lot of pressure on me, and he singled me out most of the time due to the fact that I produced the lowest amount of up sales at our store, which means not the most subscriptions, not the most reservations, but every time a guy comes in wanting to buy a game, I make sure to sell him that damn game. Which obviously was due to the fact that I couldn't stomach pressuring people because a level of morality actually took a hold of my mind. Gordon was really upbeat all the time, and when he'd come to coach me on selling more reservations and subscriptions, he was stern, but never angry or mean about it. He was a very intimidating guy, and I really did step my game up. I still refuse to be quite like the other guys, but I at least mentioned what I was supposed to be doing when dealing with customers. I just couldn't force myself to be pushy towards the customers and try to twist their arms into spending money. And that unfortunately became more and more of a problem with Gordon. One day when I got to work, Gordon was there on his day off. It was weird seeing him dressed in regular clothes. His presence caught me a bit off guard. When he saw me walked in, he approached me right away and said, "Hey, how about you? How about a quick chat?" I followed him into the back office. He didn't even sit down or anything. He just stepped uncomfortably close to me and said, "Have I been a bit unclear when describing responsibilities of your job to you?" I didn't really know what to say. I told him that I didn't believe he had been unclear. He pretended to act like he was confused. He said that I must not understand what I'm supposed to be doing. He even went on to say that he's been watching the cameras and listening in on conversations that I've been having with customers, and that I had not been fulfilling the obligations of my position. This honestly made me very uncomfortable. At this point, Gordon was acting extremely passive-aggressive, treating me like I was an idiot. He's been stern politely times in the past, but he was almost acting menacing towards me at this point. I was just honestly just scared of him, and I told him that I would do better. He told me for my own sake that he hoped that I would. Literally after he says that, he walks out of the office and casually says goodbye to the other guy working at the left store. I wanted to quit right there, and I knew that I needed a job, and I didn't have anything else set up. And I also liked my job in a certain way, and I liked some of the perks that I got, but I didn't feel like I should have to lose it because some manager comes in and wants to change the way we do things. But I also felt threatened of Gordon. At this point, I didn't really want to continue working for this guy. I had a number to our direct manager, so at that point, I decided to call him. I told him practically verbatim what our conversation was and the way they treated me. The district manager was someone that I talked to quite a few times over the years, and I thought I knew him somewhat well. So I definitely felt confident in calling him and believed that he would take my phone call serious. He seemed concerned and told me that he would take care of the situation so I could just continue working. I had the next couple days off from work, but when I came back, Gordon was working. He did the same thing he did last time I was working and told me to come to the office. He was absolutely furious with me, yelling at me for calling the district manager. He told me that it was my fault that sales were down, and I was extremely upset. That he was trying to blame me for mistakes that made him look bad. I didn't know what was going on. He told me that I was going to have to make the rest of my short time at Gamestop a living hell. I actually ended up calling the district manager one more time after that, and he basically told me that I should have tried working the situation out with Gordon before calling him and stepping on Gordon's toes. I was incredibly angry at this response. I felt like I was fighting a losing battle at this point. So after that conversation, I quit my job at GameStop. I regretted my decision a couple years after that, and I felt so resentful because I had to quit that job. That was until one day I was randomly messaged on Facebook by one of the guys who used to work there that I happened to be friends with throughout all these years. All he did was send me a link. When I opened it up, I was actually pretty shocked. It was a news story about a guy who got into an argument with a stranger at a bar. The argument escalated to the point where the guy was nearly beaten to death, using a glass mug as a weapon. And beating the man enough to the point where being charged with attempted murder wasn't bad enough for you. You could have guessed it. The man charged with attempted murder was Gordon. After reading that news article, I'd never been so grateful that I didn't wait any longer to quit my job at GameStop. Clearly, the man had issues.
Security Camera by Jared F. I started working at GameStop as an entry-level associate. After about a year and a half, I was promoted to the store's assistant manager. It's a pretty decent job, nothing too great or special, but decent. I never had any real problems at this job up until one point. Like every GameStop store, we have security cameras throughout the store. One day while I was at work, the store manager came in for his shift. He asked me if I had disabled the camera in the stockroom in the back of the store for any reason. I told him that I hadn't and that I wasn't even sure how to do that. I was going to ask him why he asked me about it, but I ended up having to help a customer. I quickly forgot about it and didn't hear anything else about it for a few days until I was working one day and received a phone call on the store line. It was the store manager, asking again about the security camera in the storeroom. He said that he thought the first time was probably just a fluke, but that he was notified from corporate that the camera had been disabled again. It was only disabled for a short period of time, but to be safe, my manager came in later that day to count inventory with me and to make sure that nothing was missing. It turns out everything was there, and he started trying to come up with other reasons why someone might want to disable that camera, but nothing really made sense. Everyone else at the store said they had no clue, and my manager eventually let it go after he couldn't figure it out. A few more days went by, and my manager and I were both working together one afternoon when he received a phone call. It was corporate again, saying the same thing, that they received a notification, and when they checked, that particular camera was offline again. This time though, my manager was able to check everything himself and verify that the camera was still plugged in. He told them this and said he had no clue why it wasn't working. They eventually had someone from tech support come in and replace the camera. This seemed to fix the problem at first, but after a couple of days, the new camera started having the same issues. They had the tech guy come back out, and this time he was going to replace the cord that the camera plugged into. This took a little bit more effort, as the cord ran through the wall where a hole had been drilled. Eventually, it was all replaced and appeared to be fixed again. But even then, we were still having the same problem with the same camera. Eventually, corporate told us that they would get in contact with the manager of the building our store was leasing, as it must have been an electrical issue. Several days later, a contractor came into the store. Ruling everything else out, he ended up having to remove part of the wall in the back to see if any of the wiring within was faulty, and what he discovered was far worse than some bad wiring. It was the remains of a fully decomposed human body. This was obviously extremely shocking and not what any of us would have ever imagined to be the cause of the electrical problem. It turned out that the body must have shifted at some point, causing it to fall onto some of the wiring and shorting out the electricity. Once the body was removed, it was an easy fix. As far as how the body got there, no one knows. Obviously, it's being looked into, but from what we know so far, the medical examiner said that whoever it was died decades ago. We talked to the manager of the building, and they told us that the building was constructed 44 years ago. So it appears that this was probably when the presumed murder happened and when the body was put in the wall. Since so much time has passed, it's doubtful that there will be any type of charges or anything that come from this, but hopefully, the body is somehow identified, and at the very least, any family the individual may have can finally find out what happened to their loved one.
The Worst Customer Ever by Jeff718. Most people know that when they walk into a GameStop to buy something, or trying to sell you a subscription or trying to get you to reserve a game, Something I've asked customers to do hundreds, if not thousands of times at this point. I don't like having to do it, and it's one of the bad things about my job, but overall, I'm happy going to work most days. I've only applied at a GameStop in a first place because of how much I love video games, and even though my job isn't standing around talking about video games all day, I do often get to talk about them when we aren't too busy. Every time we make a sales transaction, we have to ask the customer if they want to reserve whatever game is coming out, or ask them if they'd like to purchase some type of subscription. We're told to do so with every transaction, even if the same customer comes in twice in one day, or even if we're ringing up a relative. So it's just become something that I do by habit right now, and I'm used to asking. Sometimes customers become annoyed, and every once in a while we actually sell something, but most times customers say no thanks and we move on. I can understand why it could be annoying to hear this every time you want to shop at our store, but one day I really had someone overreact. I had a customer come in during one of my shifts. He was probably around 35 or so years old. He was a rather large guy, and he seemed pretty irritable at the time. He asked me a few questions and ended up buying a game system. While ringing him up like normal, I asked him about buying something extra. He seemed annoyed and said no. And that was that. The next day, the same guy came back into the store, and he mentioned that his gaming system only came with one controller and that he needed two. I told him that we could sell him another one and told him how much they were. That seemed to upset him, and really surprised at how expensive they were. And even though I should not have done this, I told him that he could go to Walmart and get a off-brand one for cheaper. This seemed to only upset him even further, however, as he took offense to me saying it. He ended up purchasing a controller from my store, and I offered him some normal extras while ringing him up. He angrily said that, just like the last time, he didn't want to buy any of that, and that he's given us enough money as is. I finished ringing him up, and he left the store. Several days later, he came in during another shift that I was working. I asked him how everything was going, and he told me that he didn't like a couple of the games that he had purchased from us and wanted to return them. I told him that we couldn't return games, but we could buy them from him and give him cash or store credit for the game. He told me that he would like to do that and wanted to buy a different game. I took the games from him and told him how much store credit it would give him. The two games he was selling wasn't going to be enough to cover the cost of the one game he wanted to buy, and that completely outraged him. He told me that he was expected to cover the cost of the game they wanted, and that he should have been given change back after too. He kept telling me that I was trying to rip him off, but I assured him I didn't set the prices or rules when it came to any of this. I even went as far as to show him the screen that had the buyback prices on him. This didn't seem to help or calm him down at all. He just told me to ring him up so that he could leave, and aggressively threw his credit card down on the counter and continued to go on about how I was ripping him off and everything. While I was going through the normal motions, I went ahead and asked him about buying a subscription. And that seemed to be the last straw for him. He started screaming to me about how big of a ripoff we were and how selfish I was for trying to take all of his poor money. He kept yelling and cursing at me the entire time until he walked out of the store. I was actually pretty upset about all of this, but we were getting pretty close to closing, and I tried my best to focus my attention on closing tasks. About a half hour went by, and I was finally able to leave the store. I locked the front, turned around, and noticed that there was still a truck in the parking lot a few spaces over from where I was parked. I didn't think anything of it at the time, and I got in my car and left. It took me a minute to notice when I eventually seemed like I was being followed. I ended up making some turns that took me into a big circle, and I was able to confirm that I was indeed being followed. I was trying to think why someone would be following me, and that's when it clicked. I look at my mirror, and while I still couldn't really see who was following me, I was able to see that it was the same angry guy from the store. I sped up to get away from him, but he did his best to stay and catch up with me. At this point, I was honestly pretty scared, and I called 911. I told him that something was going on, and they directed me to drive towards the police station. They gave me directions towards where that exactly was. They also said that they were going to have an officer head in my direction and to remain on the phone with him. It took about 10 minutes to get to the police station, and the man kept driving after I pulled into it. I filed out a report, and they told me that they would call me if they came up with anything. I made it home safe, and the police ended up calling me later on that same night. It turns out, the officer that was on his way to find us before I made it to the police station ended up running into the truck and pulled him over. They talked to the man, and it turns out he had a gun on him, but he also had a permit for the gun, and told the officer that he just wanted to talk to me because he had a question about his purchase. They couldn't really charge him with anything. I obviously knew that wasn't true, but I also understood that the police really didn't have much grounds to go on to do much more. The officer told him that he needed to leave me alone, and if they had any questions, they would have to find a different employee to ask. I haven't ran into this guy yet, or really I haven't seen him much, but he's been in the store a few times, and thankfully he's been a lot nicer. But I will say I have noticed him wearing the same gun around his belt openly every time he walks in. And every time he walks in, he gives me a certain look. I know what it means.
I don't know what to think anymore. By Anonymous. So, as I write this, I feel like I have to, like I'm obligated, but I'm also scared. I'm doing everything I can to stay completely anonymous as I write this, because I fear for my own safety. Before I get ahead of myself, let me bring you back to the beginning. I began working for Gamestop only about 6 or 7 months ago. As many of you already know, Gamestop is huge on pushing sales of subscriptions and getting people to purchase pre-orders of games coming out soon. I already knew this before I started working for GameStop, as I had previously been a customer at GameStop many times before being employed there. I have even purchased pre-orders of games before, and I think also a subscription of some point years ago. Once I became an employee at GameStop, I did my best to make my store these additional sales. I can honestly say I tried, but looking back, I wish I had done more and tried harder. I wish I tried to do more to influence my coworkers to make more sales as well. I had the best store manager I could have ever asked for. We will call him Keith, and he was extremely friendly, helpful, and never treated any of his employees bad. He would constantly stress how important our sales were, but never in an aggressive way. Eventually, he went from stressing the importance of our sales to informing us that corporate was threatening to close our store if our sales didn't increase. But I don't think any of the associates at the store, including me, really believed that they would actually close our store down. As more time went by, Keith seemed to become more and more stressed over our sales and just life itself. He was still nice and friendly to us, but he was definitely changing. He started making jokes to me, saying things like, "Well, if our sales don't increase soon, I think corporate is ready to kill me, and at least I won't have to worry about it anymore." He would always laugh when he said things like this. Sometimes he would receive phone calls at the store, and after being on the phone, he would suddenly be way more distressed than he previously was. He was also working 60 or more hours per week, many of them off the clock, trying to improve our store's numbers. One day when I opened the store, I was getting ready to leave at 5 p.m. as Keith was supposed to come in and close. He didn't show up that day, and I figured he probably finally fell asleep from the exhaustion of everything, and I felt obligated to close for him. I didn't call or text him because I wanted him to be able to finally relax a bit, but I knew something was wrong the next day when he didn't come in to open the store. I got woken up by a phone call from one of my coworkers. They showed up for their shift, and the door was locked. I happened to have a key since I opened and closed a lot, so I got dressed as quickly as possible and went to the store to open it up. I tried getting in touch with Keith, but was never able to. He was a ghost from that point on, and that same day he never showed up to work. His wife came in asking about him, saying he never came home the night before. At this point, I felt horrified, as even I knew that that wasn't something normal for him. It's been 2 weeks since he disappeared. There's literally no trace of him, and the police have no leads or theories. But I do. And I don't know what to do with this information. So I'm quitting GameStop. I put in my 2 weeks notice, and I told them I found a better job. I'm just hoping I make it through these 2 weeks okay. I would just stop showing up, but I don't want them to be suspicious of me. Once the 2 weeks are up, I'm going to the police and telling them that they need to look into the corporate people at GameStop. Yes, I'm well aware this could all be a coincidence, but I couldn't live with myself if I didn't at least hand this information over to the police. I owe Keith that much. He was way too stressed and fearful of the people working above him for me not to mention this. If you work at GameStop, or one day choose to work there, just make sure to keep your sales up or watch your back. Don't Let Customers Use the Store Bathrooms by Ronnie A. So, I'm a GameStop employee. Naturally, we've had a lot of weird customers in the store I work at. But there's one customer in particular that really stands out. This is probably the strangest and scariest thing I have ever witnessed. On what was just any ordinary day, I was working at GameStop when a rather strange looking guy walked in. Like I said, we get a lot of weird customers, so I wasn't taken back by this or anything. I greeted him like I do with everyone and asked him if he needed help with anything. He told me no and began browsing around the store. He looked like he was middle-aged. He had long, greasy hair that was down to his shoulders and borderline looked homeless. He appeared to be extremely nervous. He was acting kind of twitchy and kept looking around. As hard as I tried, I couldn't help but to keep watching him. I was just so curious as to what was going on with this guy. After about 15 minutes of nervous browsing, I decided to ask him if he was finding everything okay. He said yes and continued walking around. A few minutes later, he suddenly just left the store and walked outside. I kind of just shrugged my shoulders and forgot about it. That was until the same man walked back into the store just a few minutes later. He continued to browse around again for maybe a minute and then quickly walked up to the counter. He asked if he could use our restroom. I told him no and that it wasn't a public restroom. He proceeded to start begging me to use it and told me it was a complete emergency. Against my better judgment, I ultimately gave him permission to use it. I walked him to the back and showed him where it was. I went back up front, but every minute or so, I kind of peeked in the back to make sure everything was okay and he wasn't doing anything back there that he shouldn't. But every time I looked, he appeared to be staying in the bathroom like he was supposed to. 5 minutes went by, then 10, and then 15, and that's when I decided to check on him. I walked to the back and knocked on the bathroom door, asking him if everything was okay. I just heard him go, "Mm-hmm," and I walked away. Another 10 minutes or so went by, and I really started to get concerned. I again knocked, and he again gave me the same "mm-hmm" reply, saying he was okay. I got distracted by another customer up front and helped him out with something. Another 20 minutes had gone by at this point, and I knew that the customer still never came back up front. I was really beginning to freak out now. But when I walked into the back of the store, I could see the bathroom door was ajar. I went and lightly knocked on it so I wouldn't push it open, and got no reply. I proceeded to open the door, and was met with one of the most messed up situations I have ever seen. There was blood all over the wall, toilet, and floor. Not as much blood as you would see if someone bled to death or anything, but it still looked like a considerable amount. The man was gone at this point, and must have left out the back door. It was one of the last things I was expecting to see, and really scared the hell out of me. Unsure of what to do, I sent a text to the store manager about what had happened and called the police. I explained everything the very best I could to the police, and they took a report. They told me the amount of blood probably looked like a lot more than it actually was, and that they didn't believe it was necessarily a sign of someone being in extreme danger, but that they would look around for the man to be sure. They also gave me a number to call so I could report if anything was stolen once we did inventory. And that was it, they left. I ended up having to be the one that had to clean up the bathroom, and it was absolutely disgusting. But what really bothers me is not knowing what happened in there. I have come up with theories, but that's it. At first I thought that maybe he was trying to kill himself, but changed his mind and fled out the back. But after talking with others and describing this step by step, the most commonly accepted theory is that he came into our store to wait somewhere warm for his drug dealer. When he went outside, he bought what was probably heroin. He then begged me to use the bathroom so he could go shoot up. While in there, it took him a while to get everything set up, and once he finally shot up, he nodded out and busted his face on something, causing him to bleed all over. And because of this, he didn't want to come out front. All of that sounds totally plausible, but it still bothers me not knowing for sure what happened that day.
Hey guys, Will Ryan here once again taking care of the editing duties. Hope you had a good time. If you like, pop over to my channel for something different, or keep hanging out right here with Uncle Creepy. Either way, stay skeptical.